I'm going to tell you about one of my biggest business blunders, one that nearly brought my software company to its knees. But before we get to that story, let me ask you something. Have you ever found yourself trapped in an endless cycle of planning? You know, when you've mapped out every single detail of a project, created the perfect strategy, and yet somehow you're not making any actual progress. Or perhaps you're the opposite type, diving headfirst into projects with lots of enthusiasm but no real direction. And then you waste precious time fixing problems that could have been avoided with just a little bit of forethought. Today we're going to look at the critical balance between planning and execution. I'll show you why excessive planning kills momentum, how blind execution wastes resources, and most importantly, how to find that sweet spot where things actually get done effectively. We'll look at real examples, and I'll share a practical approach I use every day so that you can start using it immediately as well. So about that blunder. Years ago, my software company was developing a specialized data analytics platform that was targeting a particular niche with really specific needs. So we spent a few months creating what we considered to be the perfect product roadmap. It detailed all the features, relatively precise development timelines, and an elaborate 12-month strategy for market penetration. When we finally started building, we immediately faced reality. The first customer conversations revealed that two of our must-have features weren't actually priorities. Furthermore, a key technology we'd planned to integrate had unexpected limitations, and our ideal target market was far more price-sensitive than our initial research had shown. Within 3 weeks of actual development, we'd scrapped nearly half of our original plan. The most valuable insights didn't come from our planning sessions, but they emerged when we began engaging with real customers, real code, and real market conditions. The plan gave us a starting point and direction, sure, but the actual journey required constant course correction based on ground realities we couldn't have anticipated at our desks. What's worse is that I knew all of that. This was not my first rodeo. I'd been around the block a few times. I knew the pitfalls. But somehow, certain aspects blind you to the trap you're walking yourself into. You rationalize. You justify actions you would normally avoid because you believe this particular circumstance warrants an exception. The true danger lies in how quietly this trap gets you. Each small compromise seems reasonable on its own until one day you find yourself exactly where you swore you'd never be. Even veterans fall prey to it without noticing until it's too late. That's what makes it so treacherous. Planning isn't the villain here. It provided much needed direction. But the precise details we'd obsessed over became almost immediately irrelevant once execution began. So the lesson isn't that planning is pointless. Good planning creates clarity that's absolutely essential. When you plan effectively, you're answering crucial questions like, what are we actually trying to achieve? Who's responsible for each component? What resources do we need? And what timeline makes sense? Without these answers, teams waste energy pulling in different directions. I've seen projects fail not because of a lack of talent or effort, but simply because people weren't aligned on the basic objectives. Planning also helps you allocate resources wisely. In the early days of a project or even a business, it's easy to spread yourself too thin across every opportunity that looks promising. This results in mediocre outcomes across the board. So proper planning helps you prioritize and focus. But here's where many of us go wrong. We treat planning as an end rather than a means. I mentor several entrepreneurs and I see this pattern repeatedly. Planning becomes a form of productive procrastination. They're busy creating spreadsheets and timelines and projections. They're feeling accomplished without actually moving forward. It's something I used to do myself before I knew better because it feels productive. It's relatively risk-free, and it gives the illusion of progress. Spreadsheets, timelines, and projections are all important. They do add value, particularly when maintaining momentum in complex or large-scale projects. In these environments where moving parts multiply and coordination becomes critical, planning tools help keep everyone aligned and focused. They provide a shared framework for decision-making and progress tracking. But even then, their purpose is to support execution, not to overshadow it. For smaller ventures or early-stage ideas, it's easy to borrow these tools from bigger business contexts and mistake their presence for actual progress. The key is to remember that they're just that, tools, not the work itself. We can add all the PERT charts, Gantt charts, resources, dependencies. These do not accomplish the actual work. they actually take time away. Time spent on critical path analysis is time not spent working on the project that the critical path is for. Another danger is diminishing returns. Your main planning effort might deliver 80% of the value, but many of us keep trying to squeeze out that last 20% endlessly. It's just not realistic. And perhaps the most damaging is the false sense of certainty that planning can create. Markets change, competitors emerge, and customer preferences shift. So here's what I didn't tell you about our analytics platform. All of that happened just before the pandemic struck, so everything ground to a halt as the global crisis took hold. There's no way we could have predicted that, so our initial costly mistake meant it was that much harder to deal with the situation. And in fact, the project didn't recover. On the other hand, execution without adequate planning creates its own problems. I've worked with people who pride themselves on always moving fast. While their energy is admirable, they often end up running in circles. They start projects they can't finish, they change direction constantly, and burn through resources very quickly. Without a basic plan, you can't effectively measure progress or determine what's working versus what isn't. You end up reacting to whatever seems most urgent rather than focusing on what's most important. What about you? Do you tend to overplan, or are you someone who jumps in head first? Leave me a comment to let me know. I used to be an overplanner myself before learning how to properly strike the right balance. So how do I do that now? How can you do that? It's by taking a more dynamic approach that I call minimum viable planning. And it has 3 core concepts. Begin by identifying the absolutely essential elements you need to have figured out before you can take any action. For most projects, this includes defining long-term success criteria, key milestones, major risks, core resources, high-level activities, things like that. There's a bit more to it, and we'll go over that another time, but you get the idea. Broad strokes, high-level, general direction. With the bigger picture in place, now it's time to plan the project's very first steps in detail. Not the whole project, not months in advance, just the specific tasks that need to be done in order to get things moving, to get them started. And be specific. This plan should cover the first couple of weeks, maybe a bit less, maybe a bit more depending on the complexity of the project and your operational tempo. Everything beyond that can be figured out as you go. You'll refine and expand the plan as you move forward and gather more insight. This idea of planning just enough to move forward and refining the rest over time is exactly what the next 2 core concepts are designed to support. At any point during your project, instead of trying to map out everything up front, plan in detail only for your next phase, with broader strokes for what comes after. You'll flesh these out incrementally as you go along. For example, let's say you're launching a membership community. You wouldn't try to plan the entire year's content calendar up front. Instead, you'd create a detailed plan for only the first 2 or 3 months. Then you'll sketch a rough outline for the following 3 and just have bullet points for anything beyond that. Each phase would inform the next, so by the time you need to plan your next batch of content in detail, you'll have real feedback from actual members about what they value most. Which is where the 3rd core concept comes into play. In order to refine your plan based on real-world data, you need to create feedback loops. In practice, this means allocating time to review what happened, how it aligns with your current plans, and how things need to be updated based on the latest information. This can be as informal or as structured as you need it to be, depending on the project complexity. But don't overcomplicate it. For more intricate projects requiring input from different people, you might have a 30-minute meeting every week, and you'd answer 3 questions. What outcomes did you achieve that week? Which assumptions were proved right or wrong? And what adjustments do you need to make to next week's priorities? If it's a simpler project being managed by one person, then it can be as simple as them scheduling a 15-minute slot for themselves, once a week, just to review things. That's it. This minimum viable planning approach gives you both structure and flexibility, allowing your plan to evolve with real-world feedback rather than theoretical assumptions. You shouldn't be treating planning and execution as sequential steps. They're parallel processes that should continuously influence each other. So don't get attached to plans, get attached to outcomes. You should value planning for the clarity it provides, but ultimately judge yourself on results. Rest assured, that's what everyone else will also judge you for. In my experience, the most successful business people and professionals treat plans as hypotheses to be tested, not gospel to be followed. They're comfortable with uncertainty and ready to adapt when reality doesn't match their expectations. Because guess what? It very rarely does. Remember, planning and execution are partners in a delicate dance. Good planning provides direction, alignment, and resource optimization. It helps prevent avoidable mistakes and focuses energy where it matters most. Strong execution turns those ideas into reality. It generates feedback and creates momentum. Execution is where value is actually created. Overplanning and underplanning stem from the same thing: fear. Fear of making mistakes or fear of facing uncertainty. Finding your balance means recognizing when you're hiding in planning to avoid action or when you're rushing into execution to avoid thinking things through. It means being honest about which tendency you lean towards and consciously working to correct it. So here's what I want you to walk away with today. Commit to using the principles of minimum viable planning. Start with good enough plans, execute what you can, learn from feedback, and adjust as you go. For each new project, first figure out your long-term view and plan in detail those first few tasks that will give you that initial momentum. Make sure you build in regular reviews as part of your execution. I would recommend weekly for fast-moving projects. Keep developing and adjusting your plans as necessary and only go into detail for short term, with broader outlines for what comes next. And if you want more actionable advice for balancing personal growth with business success, click on the playlist link in the description below and consider subscribing to this channel. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.